Only 60s. Kids will understand these forgotten school days. The school bell rang the same way in almost every town across America in the 1960s. A real bell, mechanical, ringing out from somewhere near the front office, audible from blocks away if the windows were open. Kids didn't need a phone alarm or a parent nagging them out the door. They knew that sound, and they knew exactly what it meant. School was starting, whether you were ready or not. Most mornings began the same way, long before the first bell. Kids walked to school, often in loose groups that formed naturally along the same route every day. A few kids from one street joining a few from the next, cutting through backyards and empty lots that everyone treated as a kind of unofficial shortcut. There were no car lines, no parents idling at the curb. If you lived close enough, you walked. If you lived a little farther, you rode a bike, no helmet, kickstand down against the bike rack outside, unlocked. Because nobody really worried about that back then. Inside, the classroom looked nothing like classrooms today. Desks were bolted to the floor in perfectly straight rows, facing forward, each one carved with the initials of at least a few students who'd sat there in years before. Built into the corner of every desk was a small round hole, the leftover inkwell from decades earlier, mostly empty by the 1960s, but still sitting there, a strange little reminder that this desk, this exact piece of furniture, had been used by kids long before you were even born. The day always started the same way. Everyone stood, faced the flag hanging in the corner of the room, placed a hand over their heart, and recited the Pledge of Allegiance together, one unified voice filling the room. It wasn't something anyone questioned or opted out of. It was simply how every single school day in America began, in every single classroom, without exception. After the pledge came roll call, the teacher working down a list of names in a grade book, checking off who was present, who was absent, who needed a note explaining why they were late. And then, the real work of the day began, starting, more often than not, with handwriting. Handwriting wasn't just taught, it was drilled, methodically, day after day. A chart hung above the chalkboard, showing the correct form for every cursive letter, loops and slants exactly measured, and students copied lines of it onto wide-ruled paper, over and over, until the movement became automatic. A teacher walked the aisles during this time, leaning over shoulders, tapping a pencil against a page that didn't match the chart closely enough, sending the page back to be redone. Sloppy handwriting wasn't just marked wrong with a grade. It reflected on you as a student, and everyone understood that. Discipline in the classroom ran on a very different set of rules than it does now. A teacher rarely needed to raise her voice. A single look across the room, a certain kind of silence, was usually enough to correct any misbehavior instantly. But when it wasn't enough, the consequences were immediate and physical in a way that's almost unthinkable today. A ruler across the knuckles for talking out of turn, being made to stand in the corner facing the wall for the rest of a lesson, or the dreaded walk down the hallway to the principal's office, where every kid you passed knew exactly where you were headed and why. And if the trouble was serious enough to warrant a note sent home, that note guaranteed a second round of consequences waiting at the kitchen table that evening, because teachers and parents operated as a united front in a way that doesn't always exist now. A teacher's word was rarely questioned. If the teacher said you misbehaved, you had misbehaved, and there was no appeal process. Recess broke up the morning, and it ran on playground equipment that would never survive a modern safety inspection. Metal slides that turned scorching hot in direct summer sunlight, metal monkey bars with no padding underneath. A merry-go-round spun as fast as the biggest kid in class could manage, until someone inevitably went flying off into the dirt. Scraped knees were common and mostly ignored. A little iodine at the school nurse's office, maybe a Band-Aid, and back outside you went. Lunch came from the school cafeteria in most places, served on a metal tray divided into compartments, a lunch lady behind the counter scooping out whatever was on the menu that day with practiced, no-nonsense efficiency. Milk came in small glass bottles, not cartons, delivered fresh that morning in wooden crates, the cream sometimes still visibly separated at the top of the bottle. You drank what you were given, finished what was on your tray, and if you didn't like it, that was simply too bad. There wasn't a second option. The afternoons were often devoted to the subjects that built the backbone of a 1960s education. Arithmetic drilled through repetition, and memorized multiplication tables recited aloud as a class. Geography taught through a large pull-down map at the front of the room. History lessons that leaned heavily on dates and names to be memorized rather than discussed. Spelling tests happened weekly, a list of words sent home on Monday to study, tested on Friday, the results recorded carefully in that same grade book the teacher used for roll call. Somewhere in the middle of most school years, air raid drills became as routine and familiar as fire drills, a part of school life that today feels almost impossible to imagine. When the signal came, kids crouched under their desks, knees pulled in, hands clasped over the backs of their heads, practicing for a danger most of them didn't fully understand. But all of them took seriously, because the expression on the teacher's face during those drills told them, without needing to say it out loud, that this mattered. Fire drills were simpler and, in a strange way, almost welcome. A chance to file outside in an orderly line, stand on the playground for 10 minutes while the building was checked, and file back in, the whole thing breaking up the rhythm of an otherwise long day. Field trips meant loading onto a school bus with vinyl bench seats, no seatbelts, windows that rolled down by hand, and a bus driver who knew nearly every kid on that route by name, because he'd likely been driving that same route for years, sometimes decades. A trip to a local museum, a dairy farm, or a historical site nearby was treated as a genuinely exciting break from the routine, the kind of day kids talked about for a week afterward. Art and music classes happened on their own set schedule, often taught by a single traveling teacher who moved between several classrooms or even several schools throughout the week. Music class might mean learning to read notes on a chalkboard staff or singing through a worn songbook as a class, voices ranging wildly in tune and confidence. Art class often meant construction paper, blunt safety scissors, and glue that came in a jar with a brush built into the lid, projects tied to whatever holiday or season was coming up next. Physical education, or gym, as almost everyone called it, ran with its own set of unwritten rules. Kids changed into gym clothes in a locker room that smelled permanently of rubber and chalk. Games like dodgeball were played with genuine intensity, no real safety padding, no modified rules to soften the impact. You got hit, you sat down, and that was simply how the game worked. Rope climbing, pull-up tests, and the dreaded annual fitness exam were treated as a normal, expected part of the school year, results posted or announced with little concern for how it might make a struggling student feel. By mid-afternoon, the classroom often grew a little restless, and teachers had their own tricks for managing it. A pop quiz to refocus attention, a stern reminder about the report cards coming at the end of the term, or simply the promise that the final bell wasn't far off now. Report cards themselves were a genuine event, arriving on paper, folded once, handed directly to a parent to read in silence, while the child stood there waiting, trying to read the parent's expression for any early sign of how much trouble they might be in. There was no digital portal, no early warning email sent home weeks in advance. The report card was often the very first real indication a parent had of exactly how their child was doing, for better or worse, and the reaction at the kitchen table that evening could go either way. When the final bell finally rang, the school day ended in much the same way it began, on foot, in loose groups of neighborhood kids walking or biking home together. No car line, no waiting parent behind the wheel. There was an unspoken understanding that you'd be home by dinner time, and nobody needed to check a phone to know it. Because there were no phones to check if you were late. You simply explained yourself when you walked through the door, and depending on the excuse, that explanation either worked or it didn't. For many kids, the walk home was its own kind of adventure, cutting through a wooded lot that technically belonged to someone else, stopping at a corner store for a 5-cent piece of candy if anyone had a nickel to spare, splitting off one by one as each kid reached their own street, until the last one or two finished the walk alone, kicking a rock the rest of the way home. Homework, when it was assigned, was done at the kitchen table under a single overhead light, often with a parent nearby cooking dinner, half listening in case a math problem needed checking. There was no computer to search for an answer, no calculator to speed things along. If you got stuck, you worked through it, or you waited until the next day to ask the teacher directly. Evenings during the school year had their own rhythm too. Homework finished, dinner eaten together at the table, maybe a half hour of television if the family had a set and the assignment was done, and then bed at a reasonable hour, because the bell, that same real, mechanical bell, would be ringing again the next morning, whether anyone was ready for it or not. Looking back now, so much of what defined a school day in the 1960s has quietly disappeared. The desks aren't bolted to the floor anymore. Nobody claps chalk erasers outside after school, because most classrooms don't even use chalkboards. Air raid drills have been replaced by other kinds of drills entirely, and report cards arrive instantly through a parent portal rather than folded once on a sheet of paper. None of that necessarily makes school worse today. It's simply a different world, built around different concerns, different technology, and a different sense of what a classroom should feel like. But there was something about the simplicity and structure of a 1960s school day. The shared pledge every single morning, the walk home with the same group of kids, the report card that genuinely mattered because it was the only real update a parent got all term, that shaped an entire generation in a way that's hard to fully put into words unless you actually lived through it. If you remember these mornings, the flag, the inkwell in the corner of your desk, the metal lunch tray, the walk home with no one checking a phone to know where you were, you already know exactly what we're talking about. If this brought back memories, let us know in the comments which one hit you hardest, and subscribe for more trips back in time.